When I was in college at the University of Northern Iowa, my humanities professor wanted us to study this question throughout the semester. Why is suffering a part of the human condition? Now, I can imagine that this question is a question that we all have pondered from time to time. After all, why we suffer has far-reaching answers, none of which fully satisfy. For example, some see suffering as a test. To them, life is all about our ability to endure hardship. For those who are able to survive without losing hope or their faith, the reward is eternal glory in heaven. To others, suffering is seen as a symptom of human sin. When Adam and Eve disobeyed God and sin entered our world, our fate became one of suffering throughout life on earth. There are even those who see suffering as a test of faith directly from God, as if we are the mouse in God's trap and God is trying to see if we can survive. For me personally, I tend to see the experience of suffering as a result of the fact that our world is indeed broken and full of sin because humanity hasn't come to fully trust in the promise of new life through Christ. And what makes this so clear to me is the way that we try so hard to fool ourselves into believing that we can either control our suffering or we can somehow protect ourselves from suffering at all. Now, I'm not talking about just going about life willy-nilly, having no regard for safety. But I am talking about the fact that no matter what we do to try and protect ourselves, we cannot escape suffering. No matter how much I tried to protect myself from the pain of my mother's alcoholism, there was always something that brought that pain back into my life. A text message, a conversation with one of my siblings, and now that she is dead, little reminders of her that I come across. Whether we are aware of it or not, whether we like it or not, we all suffer to varying degrees. We suffer when a death in the family occurs. We suffer when we or a member of our family loses their job. We suffer when our child gets hurt. We suffer when we experience bodily injury. We suffer when we are given a terminal diagnosis. We suffer when we are shamed in any way. We suffer when we feel guilt. We suffer when a mass shooting occurs somewhere in our country. We suffer when the fear of war arises. We suffer as we watch our political system fail us time and time again. We suffer when tragedy strikes our community. We suffer when people cry out in oppression. We even see how angry Peter gets at Jesus when Jesus tells them about the suffering and death that he must undergo in order to save the world. Peter rebukes Jesus quite harshly for this claim. But Jesus gets equally angry and declares to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Then Jesus goes on to tell Peter that he is trying to deny the need for Jesus to suffer and die. And with that comes a teaching to all the disciples about the need to pick up their cross and follow Jesus. But what Jesus is getting at here isn't an explanation of why we suffer. In other words, Jesus isn't telling us that in order to be a disciple, we must suffer. Instead, what Jesus is telling the disciples, and us for that matter, is the fact that following Jesus, putting full trust into Jesus, will lead to suffering. For the gospel that we proclaim is so countercultural and so extreme that some people will want to do everything in their power to reject it. After all, the gospel frees the oppressed as it takes down the oppressor. It brings abundance to the poor as it robs the greedy and the selfish. It uplifts the lowly and the outcast as it humbles the self-righteous and the quote-unquote, I am better than you people. It heals the afflicted and judges harshly the afflictor. It frees the judged and condemns the judging. To many it is good news, and to many it is a harsh truth. Because of this, the people that experience the gospel as a harsh truth will want to do everything they can to silence those who are proclaiming the good news. For in an ironic twist, to have to hear this harsh truth will cause them to have to suffer. And they think that they have the power to deny their suffering with fake facades. But whether we are suffering because we are trying to carry out the work of proclaiming the gospel, or we are suffering because life is broken, and with that comes the fact that we cannot escape suffering. The other message that Jesus is trying to convey to us is that He and He alone has the power to take our suffering and to use it to mold us in His love so that we come out of it healed and faithful. This doesn't mean that Jesus purposely causes us to suffer in order to make us more trusting in God. But it is to say that because suffering happens to us no matter what, Jesus is willing to meet us in our place of suffering, to help us walk through it, and then to use that experience to shape and mold us into people that are grounded in God's love. You see, there is this fascinating thing that we as humans do called empathy. Our empathy is born out of our experiences of suffering. This empathy allows us to make connections with each other so that we are able to walk with each other in suffering, picking each other up as needed. This ability to have empathy with others is the power of God's love. For it is the result of God taking our suffering and molding it into an experience of grace. Sure, we may not recognize the ways God walked with us in our suffering right away. But I would bet that if we all took time to re-examine a moment of suffering in our lives, we will find that God indeed was present with us the whole time. Perhaps it came in the form of a comforting hug, an offering for some kind of help, a greeting card, a listening ear, a financial gift, or words of encouragement from a friend. Whatever it was, God was present in that moment, helping us through the suffering and molding us to grow in love. And what is good news for us is the fact that because Jesus took on ultimate suffering, through death on the cross, Jesus removed the power of death from our world and our lives, so that no amount of suffering can ever truly destroy us or separate us from God. And we are free to trust in this fact, because when we were baptized into Christ, we were baptized into that death. We, at that moment, were tied into Christ's suffering, but also God's ultimate act of love through that suffering which brings about new life to us. And because we have been tied into Christ's suffering and God's act of love through that suffering, Christ has the power to turn our suffering into acts of love. For in the pain there is healing. Yes, this can be a hard thing for us to understand because our bodies and minds try to do everything to naturally avoid pain. But pain is suffering is something we cannot avoid. But Christ, because He dwells with us, and because we dwell in Him, Christ will take that pain and heal us from it. And while we might come out of our suffering with some scars, those scars will be anointed in love, which will help us make connections with others who are suffering so that we can walk with them and be that signs of God's loving presence in the midst of their suffering, just like someone was for us. For no matter what suffering we may endure, Christ has already promised that we will be set free from it. We will be healed from it. And we will be able to use it in order to witness to others the powerful love of God. Yes, we must suffer. And that suffering brings challenge and doubt. But Christ promises that he is present in the midst of that suffering, that we will be healed from it, and that the world will continue to be set free. Amen. Thanks be to God.